Me? Excellent, Louise is nodding. I think we'll just dive straight into it. Hello and welcome if there are any newcomers. I'm Louise Blanke, I'm lecturer in late antique archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm really pleased to welcome Javier Martínez Jiménez, who will be discussing his new book with the title Aqueducts and Urbanism in Post-Roman Hispania. Before we begin, I realize most of you know the drill by now, but just in case any newcomers, I'll just remind the audience to mute your microphones and also remind you that it will not be possible to ask any live questions. So please do type your questions in the chat box, and you can start typing your questions already during Javier's presentation, and then we'll get to them afterwards. So Javier, he's an archaeologist who is specialized in the late antique Western Mediterranean world. He's currently research associate at the University of Cambridge ESC-funded project on the impact of the ancient city. Javier, he completed his PhD from the University of Oxford in 2014 with a thesis entitled Aqueducts and Water Supply in the Towns of Post-Roman Spain. And I think I'm correct in assuming that the book that we'll be discussing in this session is an expanded and reworked version of Javier's PhD thesis. Javier's archaeological expertise is anchored in his fieldwork. He has directed archaeological projects in Nicopolis and also in Merida, and he's participated in a number of other projects in Spain, in Italy, in Jordan, in the UK. Javier, he's also a prolific author, and he has many noteworthy publications, but I'll just mention a few, and I would like to highlight some of Javier's most recent work, such as the co-authored volume on the Iberian Peninsula between 300 and 850 AD, which was published in 2018 with Amsterdam University Press, and also a co-edited volume entitled Remembering and Forgetting the Ancient City, which has just been submitted to Cambridge University Press. Javier's current research interest concerns identity and citizenship in the post-Roman West, and he has several forthcoming articles and book chapters on this topic. So the focus on this session is Javier's most recent book on aqueducts and urbanism in post-Roman Hispania, which was published in 2019 by Gorgias Press. In terms of chronology, it roughly covers a period from the 5th century to the 9th century. It consists of 3 main chapters: an introduction, a chapter on methodology, and a conclusion, as well as an extensive and excellently illustrated catalogue of aqueducts that were in use in late antiquity. The main chapters begin with a quantifying overview of aqueducts in Roman Hispania. There were 69 aqueducts built and distributed between 41 cities, and 25% or so of those were still in use in the 5th century. Then it follows on with a breakdown of why they gradually went out of use. And Javier, he describes alternative water supply systems in late antiquity, and also the consequences of the gradual decline of large-scale water supply and what consequences that decline had on urban life. The 4th chapter examines the socio-political importance of aqueducts and also takes a chronological approach to explore water system in Visigothic and Umayyad Spain. And coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, it's really fascinating to compare these different developments across the Mediterranean Sea. One of the things that I really liked about this book is that although aqueducts and water usage is the main theme discussed, it's also a book about urban history, it's a book about changing settlement patterns, about urban priorities, about the cultural values, and about the transformation of the Roman world from the 5th century onwards. As such, I think it's fair to say that it's a book that would be of interest to scholars and students who are working not only on the Iberian Peninsula, but also on late antique urbanism in the broader Mediterranean world. It also provides a really good starting point to understanding how water infrastructure works from a technical, from an economic perspective, and also the long-term challenges of its maintenance. There's several other points that I could emphasize about the book, but I think it's much more interesting to hear what Javier has to say. So Javier, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much. Now, let me see if I can share my PowerPoint, which shouldn't be that difficult. Oh, here. Share screen. Of course, where is it?
You have to have the PowerPoint open first.
Okay, it's open now. Oh, there we go.
Yep.
And now, is it working now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and now if I put it here, I can read my notes and you don't see my notes, right? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here, even virtually, and thank you, Louise, very much for this wonderful introduction. It saves me a lot of time explaining what the book is about. And well, I actually am very glad that I came after Doug's book, because I think his book and mine work very well together. But yeah, in the words of the Spanish novelist Francisco Umbral, I'll just came here to talk about my book, and I'll try to keep it short. But yes, as Louise presented, this book is part of my Oxford thesis, which I finished in 2014. The book focuses on the Iberian Peninsula after AD 400, and it has an appendix on Mauretania Tingitana, which is modern Morocco. And I chose AD 400 as a starting point, mostly to avoid dealing in depth with the 4th century, which would have made the thesis and the book much longer. But also because it represents the last moment of calm in terms of late Roman urbanism before the 5th century invasions and deeply rooted political turmoil. So after assessing the available evidence for all the aqueducts of the peninsula, I selected a few case studies have the best evidence for continuity into this period. And with those, I was able to focus on the reasons behind the abandonment of these public structures and how this affected life in cities and the overall evolution of settlement layouts. And one of my first conclusions was that the aqueducts that continue in use after into the 5th century and beyond were those that belonged to the main cities of the Iberian Peninsula. Those cities which were administrative capitals like Mérida or Tarragona or Cordoba, or those cities which were main economic centers like Barcelona or Valencia or Lisbon. And in the map, these are marked with red stars. There was the one example, which is the aqueduct of Segovia, which Segovia was neither an important city nor an economic hub, but in terms of infrastructure and construction, it was a very, very solid aqueduct linked to a very soft water. So there are many reasons behind why some aqueducts continue and some others don't. And for this map, I would also like to underline the circle. So there's a circle in Recopolis and there's a circle in Cordoba, which represent the new aqueducts, urban aqueducts that were built in this period. So yeah, well, this is the graph that basically summarizes my thesis. Because my main conclusion is that there was a gentle decline in the number of aqueducts that were functioning throughout the late Roman period and into late antiquity, with one sharp decline in the late 6th century. And this trend only is turned from the 9th century onwards, which is when the Umayyads began to repair aqueducts, pre-existing Roman aqueducts. They begin to repair them, although the way they function is and the purpose they serve is much different in this period. So from the archaeological evidence, it is clear that the continuity of aqueducts in the main cities of the peninsula has to be linked to the involvement of the elites, which is, well, this is what I was asking earlier. And it's the investment of these elites, and more likely the city councils, in regular maintenance. So the last example of water ergotism, of private investment in public water infrastructure, is the 5th century fountain from Lisbon, which is in the top right corner. And after that, the only example is an attempted major repair comes from 6th century Merida, and where we find one aqueduct that was attempted to be rebuilt, but the reconstruction doesn't seem to have been successful. So in my opinion, this shows that while there was a desire to keep hydraulic infrastructure running as it had happened in the Roman century, it was technologically impossible to rebuild aqueducts at this stage. So it was only through basic and regular maintenance that these structures were preserved. And of course, the one odd example, the one exception to this rule would be the brand new aqueduct of Recopolis, which is, of course, the city of Recopolis is a unique example, and it shouldn't be taken as an indicator of the general trends that we see in the Iberian Peninsula. So while in the 6th and 7th centuries, we see this apparent interest in preserving public supply, what we see in the Umayyad period, especially from Cordoba, is that the new regime saw aqueducts as private property, to the point that not only the aqueducts that were repaired were diverted to feed private Umayyad infrastructure, but also the one aqueduct that was still feeding a public fountain into the 9th century was diverted, and its public use was reverted. So it was only of use for the Umayyad palace and the mosques. And in terms of urbanism, the point where my book touches on this aspect, well, water had been in many cities of the Roman period an available commodity for over 4 centuries. So once they went out of use, city inhabitants had to adapt to the new circumstances. And it seems that the ruling powers, either the royal administration or the municipal council or the bishops, the architectural, the focal munificence, the focal monumentality of these powers gravitated towards those areas where there was an ongoing water supply. So the clustering of the population might have followed the relocation of these spheres of power, but the relocation of the settlement may have also have been a response to the availability of water that may have allowed a more dense settlement pattern than it would have been available otherwise. And just to conclude, before I go over my allotted time, in the book, I just try to explain the processes by which aqueducts were abandoned, reassessing the available evidence for the main cities of the Iberian Peninsula and Morocco, which is a very interesting case study, although even though there is not enough evidence to make it an example for what happens in the rest of North Africa, while discussing how the different political powers in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages approach urban water supplies and the way in which these affected the evolution of settlement patterns. And thank you very much.